Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our discussion this afternoon as part of Hacking HR's May series on everything about well-being and mental health at work. So today we'll be discussing the components that comprise psychological safety in the workplace and the ethics around those components. So I'm going to go through some introductions and a bit of housekeeping and to introduce you to our wonderful panel this afternoon. It's a delight to have our panel with us, and we're very lucky to get all of them on board actually for this discussion. So thank you very, very much. So just a little bit of housekeeping in terms of highlighting, and I know many of you will know this already. Whilst you're not asking questions, if you can keep microphones off. The event is being recorded. There aren't any slides, so we won't be sharing slides with you after the event. And of course, the event is enabled by Hacking HR and the wonderful people there. So they will be on hand with any technical difficulties. Please do add any questions and comments for me in the panel into the comments, and I'm more than happy to continue discussions and answer questions offline as well after the event. Um, and just to confirm our objectives today, so we know that the HR profession is striving to put people at the centre of the agenda in the workplace, and that actually was the topic of the discussion just before ours. But the reality is that people can feel that HR is something that is done to them, and there is a disconnect between business expectations and their lived experience. So today the panel are going to discuss the key components in building and maintaining trust in the workplace. And of course, one of the key components to trust is employee voice. So we'll be talking about whistleblowing and Speakup. And then, of course, there's the shared goal between the business, its leaders, and the workforce of work being a safe experience that involves demonstrable ethical values and the ethical obligations and opportunities for employers. So we're going to be talking about that. So if I can introduce the panel to you in no particular order, but starting off with Rachel. So Rachel Saunders is Deputy Director at the Institute of Business Ethics and undertakes research and advises companies on how to build an ethical culture and does a lot of wonderful things for the Institute of Business Ethics. Then we have Dr. Jim Baxter, who's Professional Ethics Consultancy Team Leader, and that is at the Interdisciplinary Ethics Applied Centre. So I think I've said that correctly, Jim, the IDEA Centre. And that's at the University of Leeds. And Jim manages a team of consultants providing ethical reviews, continuing professional development, and applied research. And he's also published a book on the moral responsibility of psychopaths and published on ethics as well. And he's the host of the podcast Ethics Untangled. If you haven't checked that out already, I would definitely recommend you do so. And then Andrew Pepper Parsons is from Protect, formerly known by a lot of people in the UK as Public Concern at Work. He's Director of Policy and Communications at Protect. And Andy has the unparalleled experience of the challenges faced by whistleblowers, having been doing some wonderful work at Protect and looking at the intricacies of the law. And we can speak about that in the UK. I know there's audience members from across the globe, as I understand it today, so we're not going to be UK centric. And as a policy specialist, Andy also oversees Protect's lobbying and research and campaigns on whistleblowing and more. So, and then lastly, myself, I am Tina Russell. I'm an independent consultant, and I offer ethics and HR consultancy as well as independent investigations. My career has predominantly been working in the professional membership sector, and through that work, I've developed codes of ethics and run significant training programs on ethics and investigations, as well as overseeing and managing investigations and compliance for a range of organisations. So, Without further ado, I'll get on to moving to some questions for the panel, and we're looking forward to taking your questions at the end as well. So please do add comments and questions into the chat. So Andrew, if I might start with you, if you don't mind, just looking at, we're talking about, of course, the ethics of psychological safety in the workplace, and quite key to that is people being able to speak up. And I'm always conscious of not referring to whistleblowing only, because that does have connotations around, limits in terms of what that should mean. So, could you perhaps talk about how psychological safety can be compromised in speak up and whistleblowing arrangements? And just as an example of that, something I see quite a lot is, how you treat and deal with somebody, such as treating them as a reporter, as it's called sometimes,
Mhm.
or a witness, rather than actually as a complainant.
Yeah, thanks. I'm happy to pick that up as a question. I'm going to come at this really from a quite practical point of view. I'm not an expert on mental health per se, but the organisation I work for advises thousands, tens of thousands of whistleblowers each year from various different sectors in the UK. So we have some experience in terms of understanding the sheer pressure that can come on to whistleblowers from just the very act of speaking out. And like you said, Tina, you can think of whistleblowing as the high profile wrongdoing, whether it's Boeing in the US or some of the other scandals that we've seen in the health service in the UK. But really, it can also be quite minor things or quite small things or things that look minor or small on the surface, but in fact lead to something quite bigger in the roundness of an investigation. And so to go back to the question, the premise of the question, the pressure that's on whistleblowers is, I think the very nature of whether you call it speak up or whistleblowing, it doesn't really matter what you call it, is really where somebody with less power is challenging somebody with more power. That is the dynamic, and that can create a whole load of stress and tension for the individual. And if you compound that, I think where we see things going wrong on the advice line, and it's mirrored in when we've done polling of workers to see where the barriers are and fears. It's pretty obvious. It's fear of retaliation or damage to your career on a personal level, and also on a wider level, a concern that concerns the issue that you raise will just be ignored or won't be acted on. And those are the two kind of key issues that people bring to the advice line when we speak to the tens of thousands of whistleblowers. And it doesn't matter whether it's health or retail or within government, those tend to be the issues where whistleblowers are victimized or where their concerns are ignored, or unfortunately both. So, and that I think can create a tension, a kind of a stress on the whistleblower that can be really costly for them personally. And I think it's impossible. I kind of wonder whether it's impossible to create a psychologically safe whistleblowing process because of the dynamics that we're talking about. But I think what employers need to bear in mind is how they support the whistleblower coming forward. So I think actually doing simple things such as setting up a risk assessment when somebody does go through the formal sort of whistleblowing channels to understand where the threat of victimization can come from is really key. And having managers and they're well trained in how to interact with and handle whistleblowers, I think that's really key from board to frontline managers. And also training staff on how to raise those concerns effectively, because if you can keep those lines of communication going and you have a kind of a clear process, then I think that can alleviate some of the stress that can come from that situation. And that's the final thing I'd probably say that employers need to think about and can easily get wrong is that kind of access to support. So whether it's trade unions or us at Protect with our independent advice line, thinking about what support independent of the organisation that a whistleblower could approach and get, I think could be really effective as part of those kind of internal channels to just really make the situation that a whistleblower is in, a lot less stressful. Because I think there has been research looking into like the uniqueness of whistleblowers feeling quite lonely and sort of isolated in the kind of that pursuit, and making that less stressful is just, I think, just part and parcel of the should be part and parcel of an employer's response.
Great, thank you. I'd love to hear from you and Jim and Rachel on anything to do with this. But if I might just jump in with something quite key there, and that is that with regards to the support that's provided to employees, something I'm quite passionate about is that we don't have an end point with that after the investigation of a concern has been raised. And quite often, when I'm speaking to organisations, one of the gaps that I see is a checking point 6 months after the report has been made, 12 months after the report has been made, and even 18 months after the report has been made. And, I know that in our audience, we've got predominantly people of the HR profession, but actually, this is of a concern for those that work in ethics and compliance as well. And if if the whistleblowing function is outsourced to a different department, I still think HR has a role in terms of those welfare checks after the fact and after the completion of the event. And it's a gap that I quite often see as well. But I'd love to hear from you, Jim and Rachel, on this as well.
Shall I jump in first? I mean, just first of all to say, I completely agree with what Andy was saying about, well, the suggestion that it might not actually be possible to make workplaces into a completely psychologically safe environment for whistleblowers. I mean, maybe we might want to make a distinction here between psychological safety and psychological comfort, perhaps. I mean, certainly it's never going to be a psychologically comfortable thing to do to speak up or be a whistleblower. And that's partly because of, as Andy was saying, the differential in power between the person who's doing the speaking up and the person to whom they're speaking up or about whom they're speaking up. And it's partly to do with the kind of the ethically complex situation that whistleblowing or speaking up is, where you feel you're being disloyal. You might be being loyal to the public interest or loyal to the organization, but you inevitably feel you're being disloyal to your colleagues as well. And that's not going to be psychologically comfortable. But nonetheless, maybe there are things that organizations can do to at least try to make themselves an environment which is as psychologically safe as it can be. And also just kind of materially safe, right? So protections for whistleblowers so that they're not going to face, material repercussions for what they're doing. So things like protections in employment contracts, I think, would be a helpful thing to look at. And as Andy was saying, the availability of external organisations that can provide support for whistleblowers is really key as well.
Yeah, just to build on that, I just say two things. One is that building a speak up culture is a part of what everybody can do every day in their day jobs, in team meetings, in conversations that they're having. So speak up, listen up, and feedback. So if somebody raises something with you, even that seems relatively minor, something that they've seen that they'd like to change or sort out within the workplace, or something that they feel maybe could be done a bit better, if you take people seriously when they're raising the small things with you, then things can go much, much better when something really significant might turn up. The other point I just wanted to make was about support. So obviously Protect is there and is a brilliant service, and as Andy mentioned, trade unions are another potential source of support for people when they're going through these processes. But actually, when you are raising a significant ethical issue, you can feel quite uncertain. Is it okay to tell my colleague? Should I be talking to my friends about this? What is my responsibility in terms of confidentiality? And I think that whether it's HR or the ethics team or whoever's managing the investigation and the complaint, to just have that conversation up front. Do get personal support, whether it's from your partner or your friend or whoever you'd normally talk to about big things that are going on in your life. The discussion with the team about, if you are going to talk to colleagues, can that be something that's managed collaboratively so that it doesn't just become kind of gossip, which undermines everybody and becomes difficult, but actually there's an understanding of, who is being trusted with this information and who's going to be a part of the conversation. So, it is okay, and people speaking up or whistleblowing should ask for support, but actually being clear and transparent as far as they feel able to about that, so that can be managed, certainly when it's within the organisation, can be really helpful.
Great, thank you, Rachel, and some really great points from both of you there. And I would just add to that there's something about assessing and testing whether or not people are aware of the ways that they can raise concerns, but also the the issue about having multiple formats for them to do so. Quite often, when I do speak to organisations, and I say, how are you getting staff feedback? It's an annual staff survey, which just simply isn't enough. And Speak Up needs to have its own service and routes, and that can be multiple routes as well. And so we shouldn't underestimate the need to train managers on how to deal with reports that might be made to them informally initially, and things that you hear through a kind of non speak up process. But I love, 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 the phrase that you use there, Rachel, about speak up, listen up, and feedback. Because if we want people to use a system, then we need to show them that the system's actually being deployed. So listen up is such a big area that I see a lot of organisations need to work on, and that means having a wide section of the representatives of different levels and different parts of the organisation that look at those concerns that have been raised, as well as the actions that have been taken, but feedback as well, as you so very rightly said. And I certainly think in terms of systems, again, when we talk about how people have got systems, and particularly the organisations that have outsourced it, great in terms of recognising the resource that needs to be applied to it, but actually feedback is going to always be an internally driven activity, and that isn't something that should be underestimated. People need to see that system, and when concerns are raised, action is being taken. So really great points, thank you. So if I move to you, Rachel, about the next point, and it's quite a big one, so forgive me, but part of this, and what's so critical to people speaking up, and people's psychological safety in the workplace, is trust. So can you talk about how we can create trust in the workplace?
It's a massive one, isn't it, Tina? And it's so important and just absolutely vital. And at the heart of it, I suppose, are two things. One is relationships, and the other is integrity. So encouraging people and training them and supporting them to get to know their colleagues, to understand, their lives, the pressures that might be on them, and to give that kind of grace and consideration to the people around you to be able to work effectively in teams and support one another through good times and bad. And there's some good work going on at the moment. Something called the Relationships Project is looking mostly in public services, but actually looking at how you can redesign public services to think about people as people, and to base good services and support for individuals on relationships. And that isn't always possible day to day in organizations. But I do think that when you're talking about a topic like Speak Up, it does really help to remember that the person who made a complaint or raised an issue, or did a Speak Up or a whistleblowing, or whatever, is an individual and a human being, and they will have raised it because they thought it was really important and it really mattered to them. And the more that you can think about that, and design a process which allows for that. For example, very often when you've raised a Speak Up that it moves into a formal process, you might not hear anything for weeks or even months, and something that was really, really important to you suddenly isn't really with you anymore. It's become, it exists in a kind of organizational machinery, and that's very weird, especially when you might still be living with the consequences or the reality of it day to day. The individual or the way of working that you're concerned about might still be there, and you're living with it. So just designing in the processes of just either, well, ideally both, having check-ins and dialogues with people within the organization, but as we said before, making sure that they have the opportunity to seek that help elsewhere as possible, as well. And then the other point about integrity and just doing what you'll say you'll do is, again, absolutely not rocket science, but vital, to anybody being able to function effectively within organizations, and it has to be from the top down. Any organization, in order to really inspire trust, the organization itself needs to have a clear purpose. That purpose needs to be lived in practice through values that the whole organization owns and that the leadership of the organization lives. And those values then translate into behaviors which shape how people treat each other on a day-to-day basis. And it's easy to say, hard to do, but if you can really build that into your ways of working, you're hugely more resilient when it comes to times of any kind of challenge.
Great, thank you. Again, some wonderful points there, and actually some actions that can be taken by our audience as well. So before I get Jim and Andy to jump in on that as well, I'll just add that there's definitely something here about the procedural safeguards in place as well, because we can design the best processes in the world, but we do need the backup of policies. And I know that in the HR profession, we've talked about a policy bonfire and things like that, in terms of moving away from having rules and being more principles based. But actually, in terms of building trust, whether it's not just in Speakup, but actually, in the workplace generally, I think we need to be really clear on things such as, what do we see as misconduct? What do we see as living to the values and how you bring integrity to your work. We need to clarify that if we are getting an independent investigation of things, what an independent investigation could look like, and actually the support that's there in place for people to be able to raise concerns, including, dealing with it promptly, and just at basics, having a case management system in place, so that people don't fall by the wayside and that we're keeping on things. And I've heard some horrific stories of people that have been suspended for 18 months and still waiting for the outcome of a matter. So none of those things help with building trust in the workplace. And I think also managing the expectations of people as well, in terms of needing things like evidence, things, in terms of the limitations of evidence. If someone isn't prepared to be named and, they want to be anonymous, and the need for natural justice. So we really need to be thinking about that in the design of not just the systems, but actually in our policies as well, and actually really be quite transparent about those policies and what will and won't be tolerated in the workplace. So actually, harassment of colleagues will not be tolerated, and that could result in disciplinary action. And spelling that out, and rather than it being something that's assumed, to help people in terms of feeling safe. But anything to build on any of those points, and or building trust in the workplace, Jim and Andy, over to you.
Yeah, I can jump in with a slightly different point, which is I think also sitting behind. I think really what really builds trust is an effective system. So when concerns are raised, they're acted on, and where victimization happens, actions taken there too. And I think just to kind of to drill down on that a bit more is that I think the way to think about it is that it can really damage the culture of the organization or the ability for other people to come forward if they see their colleagues ignored or victimized. So it's obviously devastating for the individual, but it can have a real effect to dampen down concerns that are raised through the kind of system overall. And I think as part of that, I just want to take probably a bigger point, which is to lead on from what Tina was saying. Like, policies are important. I don't think everybody reads them or reads them when they need to, but I think what's sitting behind that policy needs to be, well-trained managers, which we've already touched on, but also like a board level or senior management level review of the formal processes and the data that comes up through whistleblowing concerns. I think this is really geared towards big organizations, but even small organizations can have a process where they just learn from cases that do come up and thinking about where those red flags exist. So I think a nightmare for whistleblowing teams, in the UK, banks have quite sophisticated whistleblowing teams. They have to by regulation. And I had a conversation with one of the heads of the whistleblowing teams of the big banks who was saying, what keeps him awake at night is if there's a legal case that he only becomes aware of against his bank from a whistleblower because the court documents arrive, not because it hasn't come up through the internal systems. So that's the kind of thing I think where, that review process, looking at where adverse incidents and where problem spots might come in, especially for large organizations, becomes really important. And having And then just things like having a whistleblowing champion or a senior person who's overseeing whistleblowing and having that separate from those that run the day-to-day kind of operations is actually really important. So you have that structure as well as the policy. And I think then that's really complemented with what Rachel was saying is like, then how do how do your managers interact? Because a whistleblowing policy will live or die really by how the middle management interact with the concerns coming up. Because in my experience on the advice line, around 70–80% of people contacting us for advice. So we're an independent legal advice service, Whistleblowers. It's overseen by lawyers. Most of the clients have raised concerns already. It's about 80% of people that contact us, and they've usually gone internally. They've gone somewhere. They've usually gone to their line manager. So again, that kind of making sure that those managers know their responsibilities and what's above them, so they can pass on things that they necessarily can't deal with, is really important.
So what I always say about trust is the most obvious banal thing ever, which is, how do you create trust? Well, first of all, be trustworthy, right? And that really is just a huge amount of the advice that's good to give. Obviously, it is a bit more complicated than that, but that's the heart of it. And I suppose it's another way of saying what Rachel was saying, which is act with integrity, right? Do what you say you're going to do, but there is a way of kind of thinking about integrity which is unhelpful, I think, which is to think, well, I just need to be completely consistent, right? I need to always put the same message. I need to never deviate from that message. And that can lead to you kind of brushing mistakes under the carpet or being unwilling to change your mind when circumstances change. And I think that isn't integrity, but there can be a way of thinking about integrity which leads you into that mistake. And actually a huge amount of building trust is admitting when something's gone wrong and saying what you got wrong and why you've changed your mind, and then how you're going to change the strategy or the policy or whatever it is. And I think that's really, really key as well.
And just to add as well, like a whistleblower, if you think of whistleblower as a witness, they will probably have one part of the information overall, and the organization will have most of it, potentially. Not always, but potentially, especially if it's like a systems issue, say a bug in the accounting system, whatever it might be. So also being prepared to kind of say to a whistleblower, actually you're wrong, is actually also really important, and doing that in a way that doesn't undermine them is really key. I know that most of the audience here is from the US or other parts of the world. In the UK, the legal protection stretches to people going outside the organization to regulators. So I think also part of this is also thinking about if the legal situation allows whistleblowers to go externally, that needs to be factored into your systems. You can't pretend that doesn't happen, because if the whistleblower disagrees with how you interpret the wrongdoing, that external disclosure is really important, because that maintains the public interest, which is actually, I think, really key to the kind of whistleblowing maybe we deal with at Protect. But yeah, that's our understanding of whistleblowing.
Can I also just add a point, Tina, about the importance of treating people like grown-ups when it comes to sharing information and outcomes? Because I completely understand that sometimes, what the outcome of an individual investigation is very hard to share, and needs to, there's confidentiality that needs to be maintained. But I think that organisations can occasionally be a little bit overcautious about that, and that actually being honest and straightforward with, firstly, the reporter, respecting the fact that they raised an issue and that they have an obvious interest in wanting to know what happened next, but also being able to aggregate your data maybe on an annual basis. If that's doable, it might be a different timescale is workable for you. But to be able to reflect back to an organisation, this is how many complaints we had, this is how many were substantiated, these are the broad areas under which we had issues raised with us through the various channels that people can report to us, and this is what we did and this is what the outcomes were. And sharing that kind of information, firstly, shows people that this concept of speak up is real. It's not just a kind of a mythical thing on a leaflet. It's things do happen and it is tangible, and that there are very real outcomes. But also, hopefully, it does demonstrate that very often once I've been in plenty of training courses actually where people have been shown that data for the first time, even in senior management roles, they can be really pleasantly surprised, like, oh, actually, there's a lot going on, and real changes have been made, policies have been changed. Sadly, occasionally people have to, or maybe not sadly, rightly, sometimes people have to lead organisations, but actually, there's much more learning and development that can be taken on, and real value that can be added to the organisation as a whole through people raising issues. And the more that can be shared and promoted and celebrated, even the more that people are likely to feel able to raise issues as they go through their careers.
Yeah, really great points, everyone, and particularly just on that last one, Rachel, about the triangulation of all forms of data and trends. And I talk about this in the guide that I wrote for the CIPD, the Ethics at Work guide, because we need to be looking at things like the exit interviews and the insights that we get from those, looking at the types of makeup of the leavers. Is there a particular area that's a problem here? We need to be looking at all kinds of things, not just the staff satisfaction surveys, as well as direct reports. And then just one final point I'd make on this in terms of trust as well. I think that what I see with organisations is a lot of communications about here's our policy or here is our system, not so much in terms of managing expectations of people. And that should actually include the fact that we may ask you to or recommend that you undertake mediation with someone. We may ask you, we do provide a counselling service. There may well be some retraining of the entire workforce on things like equality after a report has been made. And so being really clear, that there are actions that will be taken. Some of them can't be overnight, and that you may be subject to that as a reporter, not just somebody who is the accused as well. But great points, thank you. So I just want to move on to the next question for you, Jim. I'll put that to you. And so, in terms of looking at psychological safety, what are the ethical responsibilities of the organisation to its employees? And then, what are the ethical responsibilities of employees to the organisation?
Thanks, Tina. Yeah, I do think it's important for organisations to reflect on both of that parts of that question. So I'm going to kind of make a few points. Firstly, in the context of speaking up and whistleblowing, and then maybe a bit more generally as well. So firstly, thinking about speaking up and whistleblowing, well, I mean, we've heard quite a lot about what organisations can do to provide a context in which people can speak up with confidence and without fear of repercussions. And those are really important. And I think that's what their primary ethical responsibilities are. But then I think it is also important to think about, what are the responsibilities of the individual? So I've often heard organizations saying things like, it's everybody's responsibility to speak up. And that's kind of said as if it's obvious. And it might be true, but I think it's important to think about whether some people in the organization might be in more of a position to speak up without fear of repercussion than others, mainly because they're going to be in positions where they've got greater power or influence within the organization, right? So people who don't have much power might be in less of a position to speak up without, there being some comeback to them. And then you might think then those people that have a greater ability to speak up might, because of that, also have a greater responsibility. So I think that's worth thinking about. And also note that organizations might not be aware of the repercussions that people would face. So I did some research a few years ago where I interviewed people in a big, wide range of organizations. One of the things that came up fairly frequently, so in each of these organizations, I was talking to senior people and junior people, and there was often a bit of a mismatch between what senior people and junior people were saying about the ability of people to speak up, right? So people in management would be saying, oh yes, anybody can always speak up in this organization, it's very easy to do, and so on. And then you'd talk to somebody on the shop floor and they would say, you never say anything, it's not going to be treated in confidence, it won't get you anywhere, it'll just get you in trouble, right? So that happened quite a few times. And if you want to know whether people feel that they can speak up, you need to ask them. That's the only way to find out. So thinking about what are the responsibilities of employees. So I think, reporting and whistleblowing are obviously really key to organizational ethics. Organizations rely on people to come forward. And so it can just be tempting to say, well, everybody has a responsibility to do this, or just exhort people to come forward. But you need to really consider carefully what people might be kind of walking into by doing that, and whether you really have the right to expect them to do that. And then just quickly, the other thing I was reflecting on was the idea of like whether you can bring your authentic self to work. So I think that's something that's again, it's often said, you know, we want people to bring their authentic self to work. And I was just thinking about my own experience. I think like I've been much more able to do that. I mean, it's kind of a gradual thing along your career, right? You become more confident. You feel more like you can express your own sort of personality, you know, your full personality at work. Well, my own experience is that there was a bit of a step change during the pandemic, actually. So when we went to remote working and people were able to see your kind of domestic situation, and you know, kids were running into shot when you were on Zoom calls and all that kind of thing. There was a bit of a change in like people's ability to bring their authentic self to work. But I was just reflecting on like whether that could be an expectation, or whether that's going a bit too far. So I think early in my career I would have been very uncomfortable about bringing my authentic self to work. And actually, while it's great for businesses to create the conditions where people can bring their authentic self to work, I think that's a positive thing. I think I'd have a bit of discomfort with the idea that it could become an expectation. So I think people should have the right to say, you don't get my authentic self, right? You're not getting, or at least you don't get my whole authentic self. You're not paying me for my authentic self. What I do is I turn up and I do the job and I do it well, and that's the limit of what you have a right to expect from me. So again, in that kind of context, I think it's really important for organizations to reflect not just on what their responsibilities are, but what they actually have a right to expect of employees.
Great. I definitely have a lot to say on that one, so I'm going to need to really rein myself in here, because having dealt with complainants for over nearly 30 years now, unfortunately, the reality is that we do have people who misuse the process. And actually, you know, a key component in all of this psychological safety at work is that if you are the recipient of a complaint or an allegation against you, that you will be treated fairly as well. Because so much focus is on the reporter, and you know that includes them getting advice and counselling throughout a process. It may be that you know have to suspend somebody, for example, during a process, but that needs to be made clear that that's not necessarily as part of the disciplinary process. It may be that it's to give you some time away from the situation and actually enable evidence to be collected, whether it's witnesses or evidence, before that's corrupted. So I think that's again another thing that's really important in managing the expectations. But I also think that there's more that organisations can do on being really clear about taking action when people misuse processes, and don't do things in good faith, and actually taking action about that. And so that's just something that I'd really like to represent there in terms of the accused, and them getting support, because there's potential reputational, professional and financial implications for them as well. But just moving to Andy and Rachel, have you got more to build on what Jim said?
Can I just add a couple of things? One is that I really strongly want to support the point about the accused, and I think we can see that, for example, for me, the Me Too movement is just an enormous liberation. Like, it's so important that those issues are now being talked about and discussed, and it's no longer sort of we pretend to be surprised that sexual harassment and sexual violence is a part of what many people live with in workplaces day to day. It's a good thing that we're talking about it, but it's incredibly important that people who are accused are supported and subject to due process, because nobody will support in the long term or medium term a situation where people's lives are ruined because an accusation has been made which may or may not have been substantiated. And obviously we're talking a particularly kind of high profile challenging issue, but that it's the same whatever the issue is and however it's raised. It really does matter that everybody is supported and treated fairly if any of this is going to work. And I know we all care passionately about the fact that it has to work and that justice has to be found and justice has to go in every direction. The other thing I would just say, which is sort of connected to that, is increasingly organisations are telling us that speak up processes are being used more and more for what might have been otherwise seen as HR issues. So things like bullying, harassment are coming through speak up. And a part of that needs to be a message to organisations that employees need other ways of resolving those those issues, that for whatever reason having a chat with your manager or your manager's manager or peer or whatever isn't working, and that's why speak up is being used. But it also speaks to a shift in what behaviours are tolerated, and what might have been in the past been seen as challenging management is now seen as bullying. And when it comes to identity and protected characteristics, obviously there was a survey that was done recently by an organisation, I think it's called Youth Futures Foundation, where they found a huge proportion of people from ethnic minority backgrounds experience racism every day, and or routinely in their work. And they said that 90% of those incidents were never reported, so only 10% of them ever were even reported to a manager. So it feels like we're in a kind of slightly challenging situation where organisations are feeling like issues around, homophobia, racism, sexism are being raised in much higher numbers than ever before. But actually, people in workplaces are saying that they're not, barely the surface is being scratched in terms of what organisations are actually formally becoming aware of. So, talking about bringing your whole self to work and psychological safety, we made huge progress on a lot of these equalities issues, but there's very visibly much more that needs to be done.
Andy, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, just I don't disagree with anything that Rachel said, and I agree with the accused part as well. The only thing I'd slightly say on the first point is that because we got asked a lot about the sort of malicious whistleblowing, and I think the thing to probably bear in mind is that we keep an eye on people we don't like, and the whistleblowers again have a tiny piece of information as a witness. So I think when thinking about whether the process is being misused, I think it's important for employers to consider whether both of those things have happened. So somebody has an axe to grind or like an agenda, and they're saying they're raising something that's false. I think that's kind of where the combination is, and you have to then really think about whether the whistleblower is being dismissed. I also agree. I just wanted to say one thing on the sort of the very interesting point that Rachel was raised, which is something a shift I've seen, which is in my 15 years, the charity, this kind of movement where things that were traditionally seen as HR are now seen as cultural issues. So the Me Too movement is an amazing kind of example of that and the kind of driver of a lot of it. And one of the things is a large employer that I'm aware of have resolved a sort of sexual harassment type situation through the whistleblowing process, and they didn't have to engage with a HR process. And I think there's an attraction there for some victims in the sense they don't have to, accuse the abuser effectively or the person who's causing the problem in the department. So I think there is an opportunity where whistleblowing can be used as a way that doesn't require somebody to be a complainant, and you could do it maybe in a confidential way. But I think there's a ton of complications around what you tell the accused, how much information you give them, how the sort of implications for confidentiality for the whistleblowers coming forward. But I do think that we've moved away from these issues just being seen as like a HR issue that you would need a personal, you can't act without somebody coming forward with a complaint. I think we're in a quite different space. And in the UK context as well, regulators like the Financial Conduct Authority, like some of the health bodies as well, are considering these particular type of issues, that the sort of sexual harassment discrimination, as an indication of an organisation's culture, and are taking them much more seriously as well.
Yeah, I think what the regulators are doing is potentially really powerful. And the one thing I would just add as well is that I would really advocate for organisations when issues are raised, even if they can't be proven, then if you're getting multiple reports or suggestions of bullying and harassment in a particular part of an organisation, treat it as a cultural issue within that team or department. It doesn't necessarily need to be about going after or dealing with one individual. Treat it as for whatever reason, women or BME people or LGBT people or whatever aren't comfortable within a particular team or part of our organisation, and that's something you can do something about.
Yeah, I would just, as representing my profession, say that inevitably there has to be that cross interaction and intersection with HR. And whilst things can be uniquely dealt with through the whistleblowing reporting line, it may ultimately be that there has to be some intervention with HR as well. And I don't see that it can be separate at all. For the good of not just the organisation, but for the workforce. But I definitely think this highlights the issue of spelling out to people in the comms. The comms shouldn't just be something when you join. Okay, by the way, there's this thing here, but actually some regular communications in the organisations about what a complaint might look like, what a report might look like, and where that may end up in the organisation and how it's dealt with. But what I'm going to do, conscious of time, we've got 10 minutes left or 15 minutes because we're going over slightly, but there's some really, really great questions from the audience, but I just want to bring in two here that are connected to what you've actually all just said. And so the first one is, do the panel see or anticipate any differences emerging with our younger generations? So, for example, with Gen Z, they're more used to holding people to account. And so, making disclosures for them, even if that's not appropriate. However, that may also be via social media. And I have actually dealt with this situation for an organisation. Can the panel speak to having more of a consultative workplace, and where that may therefore mean more voice, essentially? And just closely connected to that, if you don't mind, I'm just going to give you the second question from the same person, Xander Howe. Thank you. And that is, does the panel have a view on cases where the reporter doesn't initially understand the gravity or the scale of what they've uncovered? The potential ramifications, for example, and that he's given an example here of a finance junior raising a concern on an irregularity, which then goes on to reveal a huge fraud or embezzlement, and that person had no idea of the gravity of what they've raised, because that's a space that HR then get brought into a lot. So I know the audience will appreciate any thoughts from you on all of that. So if I can put that out to all of you.
Shall I try and...
Oh, go
you go
ahead.
ahead. So shall I just try on the Gen Z point, because we've looked at this a bit, and I think it's hard to generalize because many people, especially young people, are in insecure work or jobs where it's really difficult for them to raise issues. So generalizations can feel a bit lazy, but I think in addition to ongoing changes in terms of what's acceptable on bullying and harassment, I think also it's now normal to not think you're going to have a job for life. That very few young people coming to the workforce of today imagine that their employer will be the same in 10 or 20 years' time, and that does shift the incentives a bit when it comes to the kind of the fear and futility barriers. Because if you're going to leave anyway, if you're unhappy or not progressing or things aren't working or whatever, then the barriers do change slightly when it comes to raising issues. So I think that's some of what we're seeing in terms of increasing speak up that some companies are seeing is because some of their younger workforce feel less afraid to raise issues, and that the barriers to them doing so are less because they may not have anticipated hanging around forever anyway. Although I do think that's a real, I sort of worry for them to some extent, because if you're not with the same organisation, you may well meet the same people again, and I hope that people are supported appropriately through that. But there's definitely a difference in attitude and a difference in the sense of responsibility to call things out, which is shifting things.
Andy or Jim, do you have anything to add to that?
I do. I just thought Andy might want to say something because he was coming in at the same time. Okay. I mean, just on the kind of Gen Z or Gen Z question, I agree. It's really hard to generalize about an entire generation like that. I think what I have kind of noticed, so I've been teaching in the university at Leeds for the last 18 years now, and I have noticed that students seem to, so particularly kind of in the business school, students have higher expectations of the organizations that they're going to go and work for than they used to, I think, in terms of ethics generally. But I would expect that that's going to extend to things like what the culture of the organization is like, whether it's the kind of place where you can speak up with confidence and without fear of repercussion, where you can act with integrity and so on. So I think that's kind of partly tied in with the fact that you're not expecting to just go into that organization and stay there. So you will shop around. So I think from what I've seen, and this is a very self-selecting sample of students who've elected to do ethics modules, so it's probably not very representative, but I've definitely noticed that.
Andy?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add on that. I was going to talk about the second question about the sort of not realizing you're a whistleblower, if that's okay.
Yeah,
And
please.
if anybody's
Yeah,
got
if you
anything
could
to add.
do. No, please do.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think a lot of people don't realize they're whistleblowers. And I can give two examples. Once I did some training with staff, and I put up a definition of staff at a hospital in the UK, put up a definition of whistleblowing. And somebody said, well, that's what they did every day. And they didn't see themselves as a whistleblower. Another example is there's a high profile whistleblowing case at the moment, Josie Stewart, who's a civil servant, who's been effectively fired from the civil service for going to the press, sort of leaking or whistleblowing, depending on your perspective, details about the Prime Minister being involved in a controversial decision around the withdrawal of UK personnel from Afghanistan and that kind of thing. And she also didn't realise she was a whistleblower right up to the point when she contacted the journalist and sent the information. So I think it's a really good point that people do not consider themselves whistleblowers necessarily. They feel that they are, as Jim has said previously, acting with integrity or being loyal to the organisation, if not their colleagues, and that kind of conflict they have inside. So, and the gravity of what they're bringing forward, it might be lost on them, or if they feel because again they have one small part, a suspicion, potentially bringing forward, and that's why it's really important to lower the barrier for people to come forward, and so that it's not, you can come forward where it's just a suspicion. You don't have to prove the concerns that you have, and then obviously the interaction with the whistleblower, you need to not scare them, but kind of outline what the process will be after that point. And because I don't know if people really think about themselves being a whistleblower. In fact, I think Josie, in her evidence she gave to the tribunal, the civil servant whistleblower said, I think there's some research out there, and I've not seen it actually. It can tell, or some whistleblowers have said it can sometimes take 10 years for a whistleblower to kind of understand what they've been through. And that's obviously quite a very high profile. She lost her job very publicly, went to the media, it was all over the sort of UK press. But that can be the process that people go through, the kind of the stress that people are under when they do blow the whistle. It can be part of it. It can equally be you raise the concern, is a weight off your shoulders and it's management's problem, right? I mean, that can also be part of this process. And they, some whistleblowers don't want anything else to be done. They don't want any kind of feedback. I've certainly come across that in the sort of training that I've delivered to organizations as well.
Just to quickly add to that, I think that's absolutely right. And I think one key thing is that people should be aware of where there are sources of advice. So it might not be badged as here's where you go if you want to blow the whistle, or here's where you go if you want to speak up or make a report or anything, but here's where you go if you want some advice, because people might just have a vague feeling of discomfort, and what they want to do first of all is talk to somebody and work out whether they think it's actually something that they really should be concerned about. And that's the first step. And they might not come forward if they're being told that they're going to be making a report, but if they're just going for advice, they might be more willing to do so.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that the approach of organisations as well, in terms of looking at reports, whether it's a formal whistleblowing speak up report or general concerns being raised in the workplace, and actually an increase in that being seen as a positive rather than a negative thing. And so many organisations that I speak to are fearful of an increase in reports, and actually not embracing it as actually really getting to the nugget of problems. And I think this goes to something I know you can speak a lot about, Jim, the values at play in an organisation. And so often organisations are talking about customer first, customer centric, but actually you don't see the staff and the way staff are being treated as one of the values there, or being made explicit enough. And so I think that plays into all that you've just said as well. And I certainly think that in terms of speak up, we've got the issue of the legal obligations as well that we shouldn't shy away from. In some cases, that there's a legal obligation, and actually as an employer, you may also need to onwardly report some of the things that come your way. So that may be whether it's a criminal matter, or you may have to escalate it up to regulators as well. So that is something that we also need to be very transparent about to the workforce as well. I'm going to pull another question out of the audience, and I'm going to direct that to you, Andy. It's from Michael Clifford, who asks about how the UK can follow from the Kong versus Gulf International Bank case. I'm assuming that you know about that. So a court of appeal, a judgment. So and he's really asking about that in terms of the whistleblower and the ruling that was in favour of the employer. So do you want to just speak about that and how that may be of interest to the audience and cause some issues at the organisation level?
Yeah, I'm sort of conscious this might not be, it's kind of might be setting a bad example for employers because there's lots of people from HR and compliance. Because effectively, this judgment's really worrying because it lowers the bar for in a UK sort of legal protection sphere, so the Public Interest Disclosure Act, to say the way that a whistleblower raises their concern is an issue by which they can be disciplined for. So in this case, the sort of facts are quite complicated, but effectively the whistleblower annoyed the head of legal in coming forward. And it comes back to what me and Jim have both commented on, the power dynamic of whistleblowing is you're challenging people who are more powerful than you. They're often going to be annoyed, very annoyed with you pointing these things out. And the way that Kong apparently raised the concerns, even though she was actually complimented in the tribunal as being like an exemplary whistleblower, because the head of legal was so annoyed, the working relationship was broken down. That was enough to kind of separate the sort of legal protection, because employment law wouldn't work if you're unable to discipline a whistleblower for their conduct. But it's like where that kind of separates from whistleblowing. So ultimately, we have a big problem. Kong wasn't able to appeal. That's really worrying. So I think we need a legislative change really in the UK, or another case law that kind of reaffirms the balance in a proper kind of way, because I do think it's kind of worrying. And I'm conscious that I've said that with a load of employer organisations, but no, I think it's a really silly way to look at it. I think in that kind of looking for a kind of an alternative reason to kind of dismiss or discipline a whistleblower. I think it's really worrying.
But we can use these bad examples as learnings, can't we, in the
Yeah.
organisations, and actually,
There
where we think that, we are better than that, are we? And actually, what do we need to change as a result? So, all of these things are learning opportunities. So there's one more question I'd like to put to all of you, whoever wants to pick up first, and that's from Famara. So thank you for that question. And that's, as HR practitioners, how can we advocate transparency and fairness within the organisation where all people are treated equally with fairness, honesty, dignity, and respect? So it's a big question. Would any of you like to venture any suggestions on that one? And I would love to give the audience some positive takeaways at the end of this session as we come to a close.
So I have one go to it, which is I do think it's obviously a huge question, and thank you, Famara, for asking it. And what I would do if I were I'm making an assumption that you're an HR practitioner in your organisation, is to look at your employee data and pick one issue where maybe people currently aren't being treated equally with fairness, honesty, dignity, and respect. So, is there a particular part of the organisation where that might not be the case? Is there a particular grade of employee or a particular part of a particular specialism within the organisation where people maybe don't feel as valued, and maybe really trying to focus on making a difference there. So I mean, part of it is obviously about you living your values and supporting and expecting leaders to live their values, but often these challenges can just seem so enormous in terms of trying to drive cultural and organisational change that starting somewhere practical and tangible and manageable and trying to make a difference on a clearly defined group of people who you can look in the eye and speak to and get to know can be a useful starting point.
Jim or Andy, do you have anything to add to that?
Not a lot. All I was going to say is just kind of on the point about equality. I think I don't know how helpful this suggestion is, but I think it's just that these things are changed by individual decisions, right? And it's the kind of cumulative effect of hundreds, thousands of individual decisions that are made within an organization that kind of slowly brings about cultural change over time. So you've just got to kind of be aware of these questions when you are making decisions about, for example, recruitment or about promotions or just whatever it is, and just try your best to kind of take proper account of those considerations in those decisions that you're making. So it's a bit of a general answer, I suppose, but I think that kind of is the answer.
I was only going to add, because I thought Rachel's answer was really good. I think it's really good advice to kind of pick something that you think from the data that the organisation might be struggling with, and just to maybe, I just one of the reflections I've seen working with organisations is think about the different workers and the different groups and the different groups that might not be speaking up, and then think about different ways of communicating with those particular groups. So are they all office-based? Are some off-site? And then I think some people do respond to, if the message is from the very top, supporting the kind of the sort of program that Rachel was outlining. I think that really helps. I think that people do respond to that, and they do respond to that activity. And then other people will be. I think that from a whistleblowing or Speakup point of view, I do think there's probably different people, different learners, right? Different whistleblowers. Like some people read the policy from top to bottom and will have read it before they've blown the whistle. Other people will come to it very late, and a third group won't look at it at all. So think about different ways of maybe communicating and then gathering that data to see where the impacts come in. I think that's anything I can, on a practical level, that I can think which would kind of answer this quite broad question, which is really interesting to answer, but kind of, I hope, sort of dovetails what Rachel was saying.
Yeah, great. Thank you all. I mean, I certainly would say that, in terms of takeaways for the audience as well, and, just thinking about this generally, we've got so many points that we've made today in terms of just looking at our approach, looking at our practice, how we are actually meaningfully, creating a safe experience in the workplace for our staff. And actually, we don't, and being honest about, we don't know what we don't know, and we need your help in telling us that, so that we can actually take action. So I hope that everyone on board has been able to bear with us as we went over time, because we started a little bit late. And I hope you found this hour useful and provocative. I'm more than happy to continue the conversation offline, so please feel free to contact me via LinkedIn. And thank you very much to our panel for some great contributions there and a great discussion. I think we could definitely do a couple more hours on some of these things and really dig deep into them. So you never know, we may be back for another one at a later version. But thank you so much, everybody, for today, both the audience and for the panel members. And enjoy what's left of your day, which is a different time for everyone else. So wherever you are, thank you so much for joining us.